Welcome back, everyone, for All in the Family, the importance of disability competence in emergency preparedness for families with disabilities. I'm happy to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Kara Ayers, the co-founder of the Disabled Parenting Project. Welcome, Dr. Ayers. Can you please introduce yourself and provide a visual description?
Sure. I am Dr. Kara Ayers. I'm excited to be here today. I am a white woman wearing glasses with a little bit longer than shoulder length brown hair. And I have a virtual background on today because I'm working from home. And I am going to launch into this important talk today. So let me share my screen. All right. So the title of the focus of what we're going to spend the next few minutes on is All in the Family, the importance of disability competence and emergency preparedness for families with disabilities. And I have my email listed here, which I actually mean for you to contact me if you have any thoughts, questions, comments. I know it becomes kind of like routine for different webinars and sessions that we go to, but one of my favorite parts of doing talks like this is getting to hear from people after and the connections that are made that you never expect. So were I to be with you in person today, I would roll in my wheelchair. I use a manual wheelchair because I have osteogenesis imperfecta. It's a bone condition. And a little bit about my professional background, you heard that I am co-founder of the Disabled Parenting Project. And these listed on this slide are some of my current roles. So the Disabled Parenting Project was founded, I think, a little more than 10 years ago and has since kind of been not absorbed, but folded into this larger National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities. And then I am also part of the National Center for Disability and Pregnancy Research. So this reflects some of my interests. And then you also saw on my opening slide, yet another center that I actually direct, the National Center for Disability, Equity, and Intersectionality. So my days are spent talking like this in my role as professor. I also conduct research. And I have the opportunity to be engaged in a lot of outreach activities where I get to work with members of our disability community on these important issues. With all that in mind, I don't anticipate any conflicts of interest with today's talk. So I'll kind of weave in my perspectives and my experiences as we talk today, so you'll get to know me a little bit more. So what I plan to cover in this keynote are the experiences of parents with disabilities, the importance of emergency preparedness that is inclusive of families led by disabled parents, and how we can all be anti-ableist in our emergency preparedness work. And as we get started, I think it is always important to do some level setting with our language. So there are many different approaches to talking about disability. One approach is person first language, where you say person with a disability. You might say a specific disability like person with Down syndrome, or you might say a group of people with disabilities. Another approach to language that is also valid and is important to be aware of and affirm is identity first language. So in that case, you see disability as an integral part of who you are, not the only part of who you are, or even the most important part, but just as a part that you don't seek to distance yourself from. So when I identify or introduce myself personally, I often feel most natural saying that I'm a disabled person or I'm a disabled woman. To me, I also identify quite comfortably as a woman. So I would not feel that it would be like accurate or authentic to say I'm a person who is a woman. And for many people who embrace identity first language and choose that to talk about themselves, it's the same kind of level of, unfit or just doesn't quite feel right for them to say person with a disability. You'll notice when I talk today that I bounce around, I go back and forth. I know there's value to both approaches to language. And when I work with my students, and sometimes they'll say, well, okay, but just tell me what to say. I say, well, the beauty of it is it's not that simple. And that's okay because we're talking about a diverse group of people. We're talking about a culture of disability. And so language is going to change over time. I'm sure if I have the opportunity to be back with your group and talk about this 10 years from now, we'll be talking about different approaches to language. And that's a good thing. That means that we're continuing to have these conversations and that language is evolving. Of course, the only thing I would put on our do not list, are slurs about disability. And those still are creeping in our policies, um, in some of our signage, which is relevant to discussing emergency preparedness. So out of date terms, including handicapped, you want to work on updating those, but recognizing that even if you are a strong advocate for person first language and that's what you choose to use, recognizing that there are other approaches that are valid and not correcting people on their language choice. Um, and the other kind of uh, I think I encourage for my students is do use the word disability and disabled. Don't try to skirt around it. Don't try to make up other words that make you feel more comfortable. Because when I hear people saying words like differently abled or diffabled was one combo I heard, or handicapable, what it tells me is that this person is so uncomfortable saying the word disability that it's going to be really difficult for us to talk about the challenges and the hard spots that we might come up against if we're working on something tough like emergency preparedness. So I understand the intentions are positive when we use words like like these euphemisms, and our society has taught us that disability is a bad thing. So we mean well when we come up with a word that we think we can all feel better about saying, but it definitely sends a message that I think is not intended about credibility and about knowing about your audience and your group. And it just sends signals that I'm pretty certain are not intended to be sent. And I'm also a big fan of Brene Brown. And one of her sayings is clear is kind. And so when we're talking about disability, when we're talking about disabled parents, clear is kind. Let's say it. Um, let's be clear about it. And so that we can work on these other issues as well. So it's not that language is not important, but I like to kind of level set with it and then move on. Um, so this next slide is actually a family photo of my family. So there's me sort of sandwiched in the middle here. And then my husband also has a disability and uses a wheelchair. And then our oldest is Eli, who has a different disability than my husband and I, but is also a little person. And then our two daughters. So Eli is 16, our middle daughter is 12, our youngest is 6, and they do not have disabilities. And then my service dog, Rocky, definitely part of the family. So when I think about today's topic, emergency preparedness, besides, I think, the moment of panic and dread and just tension that any parent probably has when they think about all the things that you would want to remember and have in place if an emergency hits. I think about just how many strengths we have as a family, but also how many vulnerabilities we have in systems that are not made for us. And in especially in times of emergency, where we've seen a few times how society begins to very quickly prioritize resources for members of the community that are most easily able to access them, and how quickly we forget the importance of equity and accessibility. And we've seen these lessons during COVID. A lot of my focus in the last 3 years has been towards identifying and addressing the inequities in COVID-19 and our response. And I define inequities as those gaps in outcome that are influenced by ableism. So there are some of the gaps in outcome are going to be influenced by all sorts of things, including what your health might have been prior to acquiring COVID, for example. But there's a lot of that disparity in health outcomes that is directly influenced by ableism. And so that has been the focus of a lot of my work in the last 3 years. But I also have and continue to think about other kind of disaster preparedness for our family. And most specifically for us, we live in the Midwest. We live in Cincinnati, Ohio. So we have the challenge of thinking about, tornadoes where you have relatively little time to prepare. Um, because we're two parents who use wheelchairs, we don't have any steps in our home, which includes a basement. So we do not have a basement. So thinking about sheltering in place for that has been an important kind of part of planning for our family and talking about that. Snow emergencies do come up more frequently. We get a fair amount of snow here in Cincinnati, Ohio. And this has reduced, I think, the pressure on us a bit since the flexibilities to work from home have become just more commonplace and are actually built in into my work expectations. So there's not as much of a need to kind of figure out navigating snow. But again, I do have 3 kids who occasionally things will be canceled, but they'll still be at something when snow hits, or and things like being stranded on the side of the road when you can't get out of your vehicle are different challenges to think about for parents like us. And then last, flooding can be a concern here, but this most relates to my husband and I went to our graduate programs down in Florida, where they had in Miami, Florida, where urban flooding was a concern. So, a huge rainstorm would hit, it would seem like it would pass pretty quickly, but there could be a couple feet of standing water in a parking lot, which, when you're a wheelchair user, it makes it no longer passable. So the flooding is not as much of a concern anymore, but definitely one that we've personally experienced before in the past. A major takeaway that I hope that you will remember from this presentation is that ableism hinders emergency preparedness for all of us. So when we study ableism and we talk about ableism, we know that it harms all of us, whether you have a disability or not. But I want you to see that even a little bit more zoomed in when we talk specifically about emergency preparedness, in that our inability to consider access needs slows the distribution of services or supplies. It worsens our ability to recover and to sustain ourselves during emergencies. And again, that is for everyone. We're not only talking about people with disabilities when we talk about the importance of anti-ableism. And I think before we launch into this definition on ableism, sometimes I know people are like, well, how does that work? Like, how does ableism impact? So there's some, I'd say, direct connectors to people with disabilities. So for example, my 2 daughters who do not have disabilities would absolutely be hindered by ableism in an emergency situation that stopped us from accessing what we needed in an emergency, because they are with us, right? They are our children. They don't have disabilities themselves, but they are kind of experiencing the direct trickle down effect of ableism because their parents have disabilities. And more importantly, they're experiencing the trickle down not because their parents have disabilities, but because ableism is so prevalent in our society. But there are experiences of ableism that go out much more, I'm thinking of a spider web, much more indirectly from that connection that my daughters have. And that relates to people that may not even directly be connected to someone with a disability, although most of us are, but may not recognize that the way that the system is distributing things without consideration of different equity-based needs, like how rural populations may not be able to access things in the same way, or may not be able to access even information about planning in the same way. Those are all things that impact us whether we have a disability or not. So what is ableism? So these bullet points are 3 kind of different definitions of, well, they don't conflict, but various definitions of ableism. So the first being a false belief that people with disabilities are inferior. Second being discrimination against people with disabilities. And the third being a set of taught practices and beliefs which assume non-disabledness is the norm. And you'll note that I have non-disabled here. Sometimes you'll see able-bodied, but able-bodied somewhat assumes that all disabilities are within the body. And so non-disabled is a little bit broader of a term. And I really emphasize the part of the definition that it states a set of taught practices and beliefs. I think this can help us really move the needle towards anti-ableism if we take a step back and we kind of lower our defenses and we realize that we, and I say we intentionally because I have to work to counter my own ableist views and beliefs as well, because they're so built into our society that sometimes they're even just accepted as common sense. So, unfortunately, when we look at studies of medical students training to be doctors, we find that when we do measures of ableism or their beliefs about people with disabilities and what they're able to do, we find that throughout the course of their med school training, their their expressions of ableism actually increase over time. And this is after we account for differences in ages, within med school groups. So what this tells us is that, and other differences across the population, but what this tells us is that the experience of medical school is actually unintentionally, of course, but teaching ableism. It is embedding these ideas that it is better to be non-disabled, that a reduction of disability would be better for our society and is the ultimate goal. And you can see how these things can get really easily tied together because at the same time they're learning how to reduce symptoms and they're learning how to treat people, to listen to their patients' concerns, and they're seeing people also in acute or chronic pain in these medical settings. And they may not be seeing people who are out in the community and have and are managing their disabilities and not in a crisis state. So this is not to demonize medical providers. Instead, it's to explain that ableism is really accepted as common sense in some, especially parts of our society and our community, in that it is believed to be like an obvious truth that to be non-disabled is better than being disabled. So you can see what we're up against when we're trying to unlearn ableism and we're trying to really weed it out of the ways that we do things in emergency preparedness specifically. And the image on this slide is like a dial that includes the setting normal, and just that assumption that most people want to and strive to and would give up many things to try to get closer to that declaration of normal. A more academic definition of ableism that I sometimes cite in my work and that I think helps me understand the way that ableism is connected to other isms is one written by T.L. Lewis, and it's a working definition, meaning that T.L. expects to adjust it over time. And so for accessibility, I'm going to read this slide. It starts with a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, produce, excel, and quote, behave. And again, you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. This slide has an image, it's a black and white image of a factory smokestack where we see some smog coming out. And I often, when I try to talk about ableism and teach groups who maybe have never even heard the word about it, I like to use this imagery or a metaphor of smog, because smog can be in the air, it can be toxic to us, but we may not even be aware that we're breathing it. And smog is much easier to address, just like ableism, when we can see it and we can point to it and it's very clear cut. So occasionally situations will occur where it's fairly clear cut that ableism is at play. But where it becomes just as important to address, because it's dangerous literally to our health and survival, is when we're, maybe a couple miles out from this smog factory and we can't see it in the air anymore, but it's just as toxic. This image is also important to me because I am breathing this air alongside you. I don't get a gas mask prescribed to me at birth because I have a disability. So I take in these messages as well, as did my parents. My parents, I was a surprise to have a disability to them. So I think sometimes we are unfairly expecting parents of children with disabilities to just turn off the switch of anything ableist they have been taught, and not really supporting and guiding them to recognize that, look, we're unlearning this together. There's a lot to learn with disability, but there's also a lot to unlearn. And it is really tricky because some of what we've been taught is explicit, right? Like we may have been told, and it's not all bad. So I'm going to try to give examples that aren't all bad. So we may have been told to be extra nice to Henry at school because your mom saw that he was in a wheelchair and she made sure you told that to tell you be extra nice to him because he's in that wheelchair. So sending this message of that we need to be extra nice to people with disabilities, and also kind of this like concern and pity for them, right? So it's very well intentioned, but that's something we've been taught about disabilities as growing up. Again, these are examples. And so when we go on and we have kids with disabilities, we don't often have these opportunities to unlearn ableism because it is assumed that we don't have it because we now are the parent of a child with a disability. Another way that we are taught um, these ableist beliefs is by what we don't see. So when we don't see people with disabilities represented in our stories and in our media and in our who are our teachers and who are our leaders in our communities, we never see people with disabilities, or if they have disabilities, we don't know that because they don't talk about that part of themselves because of lots of reasons, right? So what we don't see also sends us a loud and clear message and is also something that we need to intentionally unlearn. And I mention this because if you have the opportunity to be a part of teams that are developing materials for emergency preparedness, ensure that if I'm a family who has a child or an adult with a disability, that when I look across all your materials, I see families like mine represented, that I know you're considering me, you're thinking about our family, and that, if you're inviting people to be a part of your work, that we would be invited because you're already thinking about us. And that doesn't happen very often, as often as it should, even if we look at how large disability is as a segment of our population and our communities. So ableism can be covert, but it can still be poisonous. So when we think about ableism as it relates to parents with disabilities, there are some specific kind of intersections at this group and ableism itself. So first we have these stereotypes about positivity that can be toxic. And so as I mentioned before, the example of, Henry, we need to be extra nice to him. The reason that this can become a problem is, or one reason, is that it can just, in times of emergency and disaster, we need our communication to be clear. And we need to have kind of this effective, clear streams of communication. And if we're kind of bogged down by these ideas of people who we don't really know or we don't really see as kind of whole beings, and I don't think any of us are always happy, always positive, always hopeful, then we miss out on an authentic connection. And so sometimes you hear these stereotypes in a very disability specific way. So I know folks from the Down syndrome community will talk about how the stereotypes about always being happy are ones that they and their families experience frequently. And again, I think the question is, well, what's the problem with that? And so the problem with that is it's kind of like a speed bump, if not a barrier, to opening those lines of communication, that we need to be open and we need to have trust on both sides, and be seen as whole, real, authentic people, not as kind of these inspirational or always positive people. Another area specific to parents with disabilities are high rates of distress, but low social support. So this can vary a little bit across parents with different kinds of disabilities. So this is kind of a generalization across a diverse group, which is parents with disabilities, but just recognizing that some of the more typical places that you might access social support may not be accessible to parents with disabilities. So those may not be options for them to get that same type of social support. Fear, isolation, and uncertainty can combine for negative outcomes. And then the fourth one on this slide is accessible services often assume a disabled person is alone or the child in a family. So transportation options are often baffled by what to do if a disabled person has a child or a child in a car seat, because they're almost entirely built on the assumption that a person with a disability who uses their services would be by themselves or accompanied by a caregiver. So many systems and services are built not able to kind of like compute the idea that the parent may have a disability and may also be a caregiver, and their children may or may not have disabilities. And this trickles down all sorts of places you wouldn't anticipate, even Disney, for what it's worth. They are very confused by how to seat our family in the shows because they have systems worked out for a wheelchair and a caregiver. But it becomes a lot more complicated when you have, in our family, 2 wheelchairs, and we also need to be seated with all 3 of our kids because they don't need to be in a different place of the theater or whatever for a show. So I think you can probably think of the many places where either or both of these assumptions are made in the way that services are delivered or planned for. You'll also see it sometimes that drive-up services will be made available. And that can be great for some people. If for our family where we have 2 drivers, that's fantastic. It's a lot more accessible for me not to have to get out of my vehicle. But for families, I have a friend who both parents in that family are blind. Drive-up services are not accessible for them. So you really have to think about the diversity within the group of parents with disabilities as well. I think another important point that I wanted to just put out there so that we could talk about it or you could think about it is that many parents with disabilities have significant distrust in our system due to very real experiences of ableism. And those experiences have often come alongside probably the most scary threat we have as parents, which is the very real potential of our children being removed from our care. Many of us who are parents with disabilities have heard and known many stories, more than just like a few here and there that are flukes, of parents with disabilities who have unjustly and unfairly been separated from their children, often based on misconceptions about the parent's disability or just ableism in our society about a view that non-disabledness would be a better way to raise children. Many states still have laws that allow for direct discrimination in parenting on the basis of disability alone. So this often comes up in custody disputes and in states where laws have not been made to clarify and to explicitly prohibit discrimination. Their previous state constitutions often say something like a child can be removed on the basis of disability or substance abuse. It's often worded in kind of an either or way. And so I bring this up to reiterate that there are very real and valid reasons that parents with disabilities may be reluctant to share what they need in a planning process, and they may wait until what I know is not ideal, but after an emergency hits, and then still only share what they feel is absolutely essential to get their family what they need, but recognizing that there are many reasons that people may not disclose that they have a disability or what their disability related needs are. One of the challenges that I have in researching and working with and trying to better support parents with disabilities is often identifying who parents with disabilities are, not because they are extraordinarily rare. They're not. We know that about 1 in 10 kids in America in the United States are being raised by at least one parent with a disability. Um, but if I were to go into a room with 100 people and say, raise your hand if you're a parent with a disability, I think it would not be uncommon that I would be the only one happily raising my hand. As an adult with a disability, especially if that individual does not culturally or socially identify as having a disability, which I think we've talked about up to this point, the many reasons why they culturally may not feel like that is a point of pride or something to identify themselves with. And if they don't receive services or supports related to their disabilities, they really might not see any reason to bring it up. For many parents with disabilities, the last time that they kind of were identified may have been in school during their education process. And that's actually how some state systems identify parents with disabilities is they ask after the family is connected to like child protective services or sometimes early intervention, or they'll ask the parents, did you receive any extra help when you went through school? And when if the parents say, yes, I had an IEP or I was in special classes in quotes, then that helps give an indicator that this parent is likely to have some type of disability, especially when we look at the broad scope of disability, right? When we're thinking about neurodivergence and a wide range of invisible disabilities as well. So there are benefits to identifying with a disability, and I focus on those in other parts of my work. And sometimes I get to bring that into my parenting work in terms of that there are psychosocial benefits to accepting one's identity with a disability and identifying as such when it fits and is comfortable for the person. But I want to bring this up because as you serve parents with disabilities in your work or you think about their needs, it may be challenging for you to find people who will raise their hands and identify as such, but please know that they are out there, that this is not an exceptionally small group of people, that it's important work to consider them. And you may just have to do that for a while before you get kind of that validation of people saying, yeah, that's me. And really the access to emergency planning and preparedness is what's important, not so much people explaining to you what category they fit in to get it. But I wanted to add just maybe 3 more kind of vocab words connected to ableism for you, in that all 3 of these you'll see across your work as you consider emergency preparedness related to parents with disabilities. So the first is internalized ableism, and this just shows an individual in a wheelchair, because internalized ableism is when we take in these ideas and we might have ideas that we're not worthy of help during an emergency. We might have ideas that will be too much trouble. So again, kind of taking in and believing these ideas that disability is a burden on our society and that we shouldn't ask for extra help that we need. So sometimes this will come up that people will be hesitant or delay their requests or expressing their needs because of their own internalized ableism. You're probably more familiar with interpersonal ableism, which just means, between people, between one or more groups of people. And so sometimes this comes up in the ways that we communicate about disability when we're not culturally informed. So you can also always, work with folks that are disabled to ensure that your materials are authentic in their connection to the disability community. And then this third type of ableism is systemic or institutional. They're not exactly the same, but for our purposes, we just mean that the way that our systems and services are constructed grow out of the soil, again, that we talked about kind of the roots of ableism, um, that is poisoned by ableism, not to be dramatic, but so the system often has a hard time working for people with disabilities because it wasn't built to work for people with disabilities. And whether that be an oversight, I would say that we're almost 33 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I'm not sure how long we can say that physical inaccessibility is an oversight. At some point, it becomes an active choice not to improve our environments to better, to be more accessible. So the systemic or institutional ableism is at that level that we struggle with. Again, it's usually that smog that we can't quite see, but we know is there. And many of us work on those barriers as well. So when you're doing anti-ableist work, you're not only not being ableist, you are actively pushing against that. And so some of the things that I want you to consider are the communication of your work, the inclusion, of course, of sign language interpreters, other forms of accessible communication like plain language summaries. It'll be important to think about accessible shelters and evacuation routes. And again, thinking about the challenges of disability and caregiver status in terms of dynamics of families with disabilities. So you may have someone who both needs assistance in their activities of daily living, like bathing, dressing, and that same person may be a caregiver for somebody else in the family. Um, so we really need to challenge kind of what our core family might look like as we think about supporting these families and realize that caregiving and care receiving is often kind of multi-directional across these families. And I also want you to consider service animals and their needs and how, you know, how they kind of fit into this whole picture, as that's part of making emergency preparedness and disaster response accessible and equitable. I always try to think of some strategies that you could start today. So these are some anti-ableist strategies in thinking about emergency preparedness that you could at least start today. So the first is reframing barriers. So you can work on reframing barriers as problems with society and the way that our systems are built rather than in the individual itself or him or herself. So here's a really straightforward example of a change of wording that also puts forth a change in thinking. So the first example is she can't get into that building because she's in a wheelchair versus she can't get into that building because it's not accessible. So not only is I'm not suggesting this reframing as like a nicer way to put it, but because the second one, she can't get into that building because it's not accessible, is both are true, but the second one actually gives us the path to a solution to improving accessibility, and not only for this individual in a wheelchair, but also um, an individual who might use a cane for mobility. Also, we could go down the list of how many people would benefit from a more accessible option to enter this building. So this, for those that are familiar with models of disability, this is shifting from a medical model, which sees the deficit in the person, she's in a wheelchair, to a social model, which sees the deficit in our society not being accessible. I also just briefly previewed that there are benefits to building a disability identity. And so I wanted you to think about that as you um, read and learn about disability, which I hope you all do. Um, so there's really fascinating research by Kathleen Bogart that has shown that people with stronger disability identity have lower rates of anxiety and depression, and that a disability identity affirms disability rather than denies it. So when we disclose or we share about our disability, it's affirming. And providers can support this identity formation by acknowledging ableism, talking about it, using that word, also acknowledging pain, mental health challenges, social complexities. So again, saying the word And there's actually a whole campaign that's hashtag say the word that means just that, letting people you work with, members of the disability community, know that you are open to talking about these things. I don't think anybody expects one person to solve all the challenges of accessibility of the world, but it is such a relief to know when somebody is open to talking through them with me as a parent and somebody who has what feels like a pretty heavy responsibility of a family's safety when we think about emergencies. And by doing all this, we can learn how to be better allies. And I think, thinking through what you have been doing yesterday and today is a great start to that, if today is a start for you. Also, parents with disabilities specifically can prepare, plan, and practice. So one of my coping strategies is over preparing and over planning. It's kind of a way that I guess try to deal with my anxiety. And so thinking about what we would need in certain situations, remembering medications, chargers, important documents, all of this comes with incredible privilege, though, not only monetarily, but I think I know COVID taught our family, you always hear things like, make sure you get, a month's worth of medication in advance. Well, most of the prescriptions that our family needs won't even give you more than like 2 or 3 days in advance. So you can't kind of practice sometimes what is preached. And so that is part of like learning the systems too. But COVID taught me that. And so now I know that we cannot count on having like a advanced supply of medication because the prescriptions and the pharmacy, they just don't work like that in that case. Um, the P for planning, safe evacuations. So knowing routes of where you would go, also asking your child's school about their plans during an emergency. Some of my work through the National Center for Disability Equity and Intersectionality is actually looking at accessibility considerations during the active shooter drills that are held in kids' schools, which is a sad reality of our time, but one that we also need to be considering disability. And this third one is practicing evacuations like fire drills with family members. And thinking about parents with disabilities, if you haven't read Michelle Obama's memoirs, one thing I did not expect was that a significant portion of her identity is that her dad had a disability. And so she talks in this book about this fear that the family had and that she had of a fire and how her dad would get out in time enough. And so the kids actually were anxious about this and made him practice like laying on the floor, and her brother would like try to drag him out the door. And but I think it speaks to the family's recognition of talking about that fear of how would disability play out if we had an emergency, and how can we be as best prepared as we can. Um, and so role playing, asking for help, explaining needs is all part of this. People with disabilities must be part of your organization's planning for emergency preparedness. I hope I'm not the first person to tell you that or for you to think about it. But if you needed a little bit of extra umph behind your advocacy for that, I really like this article by Ari Neiman and colleagues. Ari is an autistic researcher and scholar. And so this article titled "The Treatment of Disability Under Crisis Standards of Care." So what they did is they looked at the states. All the states developed their crisis standards of care shortly after the start of the COVID-19 national health emergency. And some of the states had to go back because their crisis standards of care violated constitutional rights of Americans with disabilities. Because if you'll remember, some of these crisis standards of care directly triaged care away from people who had disabilities. And so what was fascinating about this analysis that Ari and colleagues did was that they found that of the states who included people with disabilities in their boards and committees that came up with their crisis care standards, they were far less likely to be pushed back by courts as unconstitutional. So they were much more effective crisis standards of care, and that they weren't kicked out by the courts. So it's kind of I think, a fascinating bit of research support that, again, involvement and representation of people with disabilities in your planning is better for everyone, and just improves your outcomes and your effectiveness. So this is how you can reach me. You're welcome to reach me email. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and then this is a QR code. If you point your phone at that, I'll leave it up just for a couple seconds. You can see other publications that I have over Google Scholar, but I did want to make sure that we had a few minutes for questions, and I'm happy to take those now.
Hi, so if you have any questions for Dr. Ayers, can you please put them in the Q&A box? Okay. Don't see any yet. Oh, I said,
I got one too,
yeah.
an email.
Bobby Davis says, thank you so much. This was a great presentation. Agreed.
Thank you.
Hold on 1 minute. Someone sent a question to our email.
Okay.
Sorry, it hasn't arrived yet. There seems to be a lag.
That's okay. Okay, a comment so that I think the person emailed me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think one thing I did mention, and I can kind of talk a little bit as the questions come in, is that I do recognize that it can feel overwhelming to think about ways to plan for all sorts of disability related needs that you might not be familiar with. But that's where you can also draw in on the strengths of people with disabilities, including parents with disabilities, and that many of us have a lot of problem solving experience. That's not to say that, we want to or should shoulder the load of organizations that should figure out these plans. But I know that I and many of my colleagues and friends are more than happy to share what has worked for us. And sometimes it's very straightforward and not like a high tech, high expense solution. And so before you kind of invest a lot of time spinning your wheels, it can really help to connect with the community and find out what are people doing, what's worked, what hasn't. Great. I think I see one here about how can emergency preparedness incorporate intersectionality considerations for families? Definitely. So thinking about, I see intersectionality as kind of layers of marginalization that people might experience. And I recognize that intersectionality is not, sorry, the screen froze for a bit, is not deficits based or negative, but it can be layers of bias that a family in this case might face. So again, I think we have to challenge ourselves to think outside of those molds that we've created for a family, where we assume that when we hear that there are two parents and two kids that are in need of XYZ, that we're assuming that it is, a heterosexual couple, or that it's even a couple. Many parents with disabilities have informal kind of support networks that help them. I know that in my slide, I discussed how there's still this gap between needs and support, but that exists as well as that many parents with disabilities do have informal supports. And one reason for that is because many of our services don't consider parenting. Parenting in the United States is not considered an activity of daily living. So it is actually considered an activity of daily living in Canada. And so in Canada, you're able to get direct support for your disability in parenting. In the United States, parents often have to kind of have workarounds to that. So, for example, they can get help bathing themselves, but if they're a single parent and have a child, they can't technically get government assisted help bathing their child. So that's often where informal networks of support come into play.
Okay, we have another question that may be a little bit specific. Elizabeth Barnett writes, my condo association has no access to clubhouse meeting room, also no handrail at outdoor steps. Can the condo association break the ADA rules? It's a little
think-
specific, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to hear this question and I knew you lived in Ohio, I would I would say that you should reach out to our Ohio Disability Rights, which is, our protection advocacy, which is kind of our Ohio version of what you have with our hosts here from Disability Rights New York. From my experience, condo associations are complicated in what it seems get away with, but you might want to check into that and get some support in finding that out.
Jeremy Demick asks, in larger buildings in cities like Cleveland or New York City, how do you integrate elevators into planning?
That is not my area of expertise. They are obviously important, but yeah, I mean, obviously future planning must prioritize accessibility, but there's a lot we can do when we go back and renovate and improve things too. And I think, unfortunately, accessibility has not been a part of that prioritization as much as it should be.
Any other questions for Dr. Ayers? Please put them in the Q&A box.
I would also recommend that if you, in the future, encounter parents with disabilities, to connect them. So our Disabled Parenting Project is mostly a very active group online. It's a Facebook group. And so that is a way for kind of peer-to-peer connection with other disabled parents. We are also part of the larger National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities. And so that's a great resource for legal rights, research around parenting with a disability. There are webinars. So if you want more information, you can sign up for their newsletter, and you can, I think, over time, learn more about this population too.
I know we were expecting another question by email, but I haven't received it. Has anyone else received that question by email? So Dr. Ayers, since it hasn't arrived, can we forward it to you?
Yeah, sure.
After the presentation? Wonderful. Thank you.
Definitely. Yeah, and anybody else is
Go ahead.
welcome to after the presentation too, if you have a question you didn't think of.
Okay. Well, Dr. Ayers, thank you so much for your presentation. And we'd like to thank each of our speakers today, as well as all of you who have attended. If you have any questions, please email emergencypreparedness@drny.org. And the recording of this event will be made available on our YouTube channel within 2 to 4 weeks.
Thank you.